It was just another night on patrol. I was already a confirmed police officer, and that night I was aboard the FRC-11, the fast response car, with a partner. In the back seat, we had a police trainee PT. It was around 3 a.m., and we were on the Pan Island Expressway PI, heading to a checkpoint. I was driving, somewhat distracted, when my partner tapped my shoulder and pointed in the opposite direction. About 150 meters away, something caught our attention. A woman, alone, was slowly walking along the center lane of the highway. She was wearing a red dress, an unusual and extremely dangerous sight. We decided to take the next exit and circle back to approach her and offer assistance. But when we reached the spot where we had seen her, there was no one there. I rolled down the window, and at that moment a sweet scent of fresh flowers filled the patrol car. There were no flowers around. I immediately remembered an old belief: when that scent appears without explanation, it means a spirit is nearby. The air grew heavy, but we said nothing. Feeling more unsettled than we cared to admit, we continued toward the checkpoint. The checkpoint lasted about an hour. Around 4 a.m., we were back in the car when we heard another officer requesting leave. He was at the scene of a suicide, waiting for the investigator. The incident had occurred in a building about 15 kilometers from where we were. Something stirred inside me. As officers, we had seen terrible things on the job, but I couldn't help thinking about the PT, the rookie, and how he would react to witnessing something so gruesome. I suggested we visit the suicide scene. My partner agreed, and off we went. When we arrived, I saw the body covered with newspapers. It was a recent case from the early 90s. The smell of death lingered in the air, but something caught my attention. When I lifted the newspapers, the sight froze me in place. The body was of a woman, and she was wearing a red dress exactly like the woman we had seen earlier. I couldn't believe it. I looked at my partner, who was also silent. With wide eyes, he spoke the words that were already in my mind: "It's her. The lady in red." I decided to ask the officer on the scene some questions. He confirmed that the suicide had occurred around 1:30 a.m. and that he had been there since 2 a.m. But that didn't make sense. There was more than an hour between the discovery of the body and the moment we saw the woman on the PI. I knew that, in Chinese beliefs, if someone dies by suicide wearing red, they return as a vengeful spirit. A chill ran down my spine. And that's when the truth became clear: the woman we had seen on the highway was not just a passerby. She was something else, something that no longer belonged to this world. The lady in red had returned, and we had seen her long before we realized what was really happening. Six months had passed since that fateful encounter on the highway. It was now August 1993, and the atmosphere was tense. August, for the Chinese, is known as the month of the hungry ghosts. It is said that during this time, the gates of hell open, allowing spirits to roam freely on earth. The belief is strong, and many people make offerings of food and other items to appease the spirits. It was early morning, around 4 a.m., and I was on patrol with an SC, a special constable, a member of the National Service Police Force fulfilling his mandatory service. We were patrolling near the Ju Chiat complex when the operations room called us. Operations room, Ubi 01 location, me. Ubi 01, location at Ju Chiat complex. Operations room, Ubi 01, please proceed to block 34X Ubi AV2, unit 10XXX. Me. Understood. Operations room. Complainant, our term for people who call the police, reported seeing a headless body floating outside her kitchen. Note: the complainant is on the 10th floor, so outside the kitchen window there is just empty space. Me. Understood. Heading out from Ju Chiat complex. I turned off the radio, stunned. I looked at my partner, trying to hide my disbelief. I whispered, "WTF? What do they expect us to do if we get there and actually see a headless spirit? Do we pull out the handcuffs and arrest it? Take it to the station and charge it with loitering with intent? Do they think we're Ghostbusters?" We arrived at the building shortly after and knocked on the complainant's door. A young Chinese woman in her 20s opened it. She was pale, visibly shaken. Without hesitation, she hid behind us and pointed toward the kitchen. I instructed my partner to take down her details and ask what had happened. With a lump in my throat, I approached the kitchen. I tried to turn on the light, but nothing happened. I took out my flashlight and started inspecting the area, moving toward the window. That's when I saw it. Something red, hanging from the branch of a tree below. And then the smell. The same sweet scent of fresh flowers, just like last time. The feeling overwhelmed me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pretended I hadn't seen anything and continued searching the apartment. Nothing. No other clues. I went back to the complainant and began questioning her. She told me that when she went to get a drink in the kitchen, she saw a woman's body floating outside the window, wearing a red dress. The fear in her eyes was real. I knew she wasn't lying. She was genuinely terrified. But since we found nothing and I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible, I started thinking about resuming our patrol. That's when she asked, in a trembling voice, if we could stay until sunrise. The request was relayed to the operations room, and we were ordered to remain there until morning. As we waited, I started talking to the woman. She told me she had moved into that unit about a month ago. The apartment belonged to her boyfriend, who was away on a business trip and would return in a few days. She added that during this time, she had been getting bad feelings and frequently smelled flowers at night. The weight of that conversation settled over me. Something wasn't right. We were in an ordinary city, on an apparently normal night, but what I felt was anything but normal. The sensation of being watched, the presence lurking in the corners of the apartment, the scent of fresh flowers. And deep down, I knew that what she had told us was just the tip of the iceberg. Two weeks had passed since the last case. It was another night shift, and as part of our rotating shift schedule, I found myself working around 4:30 a.m. The operations center sent me to Block 34X, Ubi Avenue 2, near the open area, for a case of parachuting, our slang for high-altitude suicides, when someone jumps from a building. I arrived at the scene and saw a middle-aged man lying on the ground in a pool of blood. His head was crushed, and brain matter was scattered across the sidewalk. It was already clear that he was dead, but according to protocol, we had to wait for the ME medical examiner to officially declare the death. I called for an ambulance and while waiting began to check the body. I needed to check his pulse, ID, and other details to identify the victim, notify the family, and see if he had left a suicide note. That was when, once again, I smelled the unmistakable scent of fresh flowers. I looked up and saw, high up on a nearby tree branch, the figure of a woman dressed in red. Her eyes were bloodshot, glowing with a demonic light. I knew what I was seeing. Something supernatural. But as usual, I pretended not to notice and continued with my work, trying to stay focused on the scene. As I searched the victim's pockets, I found his wallet and ID. When I turned it over, I saw the registered address. It was the same address from the case I handled 2 weeks ago when the complainant called us to investigate the headless body. A chill ran down my spine. I looked back at the tree branch, and there she was, the lady in red. But this time, her face shifted into that of a young, beautiful woman. She smiled, waved goodbye, and vanished before my eyes. I blinked multiple times, trying to process what I had just seen, but she was gone. With my heart racing, I went up to the victim's unit. The house was in complete chaos, as if a violent struggle had taken place. I didn't know why the neighbors hadn't called the police, but when I asked later, none of them claimed to have heard any noise coming from there. The rest of my shift passed without further incidents, but I was clearly disturbed by what had happened. I couldn't just let it go. I decided to investigate further by talking to the neighbors. That's when I discovered something unsettling. The man who had committed suicide was married, and his wife had taken her own life about 6 months earlier, jumping from the same building. The most chilling detail? She was wearing a red dress when she jumped. Additionally, the neighbors told me that about a month before the man's suicide, his new girlfriend had moved into the unit. but she left the house just a week before the tragedy. Based on the information I gathered, my theory is that the lady in red took her own life after discovering her husband's infidelity. She returned from beyond to haunt him and his new girlfriend. However, it seems she had no intention of harming the girlfriend. The young woman probably didn't know the man was married. The woman in red then came back to take revenge on her unfaithful husband, dragging him to hell with her. I wasn't harmed, and I have an explanation for that. I believe the lady in red knew I was just doing my duty. I hadn't wronged her in any way. Perhaps that's why she returned to her normal state, smiled, and even waved goodbye before disappearing. I know this story might sound absurd, and you may choose not to believe it, but for me and for anyone who has experienced something similar, this is not just a story. It was a real event that happened to me while I was doing my job as a police officer. It was just another night on duty when I was still working as a homicide detective. I received a call from dispatch informing me about an elderly man who had called 911, saying that his wife was dead and that it was his fault. When they asked if there was anyone else in the house, he said yes. However, when they questioned who else was there, he simply replied, "No one." Upon arriving at the scene, I found his wife dead on the couch. There was visible trauma to her head, but nothing excessively brutal. As I always did at crime scenes, my first action was to check all the rooms to ensure the area was secure and that the scene wouldn't be contaminated. Meanwhile, the officers in the garage kept the husband in custody. He was being extremely polite and cooperative. After inspecting all the rooms and finding nothing out of place, I joined the lieutenant in the kitchen to discuss the case. The layout of the house was peculiar from the kitchen. You couldn't see the front door directly, as a partial wall separated the rooms. However, the living room was directly in front of the entrance, about 15 feet away. In the middle of our conversation, we suddenly heard the creaking sound of the front door slowly opening. My first reaction was irritation, assuming that some careless officer was entering the crime scene without permission or allowing someone else inside. I quickly turned the corner to see what was happening and found the door slightly open, but no one was there. I thought someone might have left. But before the main door, there was a screened-in porch, and its door was locked from the inside. That made it impossible for anyone to have reached that point without unlocking it first. The lieutenant and I exchanged confused glances. Our only logical explanation was that the door might not have been fully closed, and that a strong wind could have pushed it open. However, when I touched the door to close it again, I realized it was a heavy steel door impossible to be moved by the wind alone. Moreover, the door's position created a perfect straight line to the woman's body. The atmosphere immediately became more tense. With this unsettling feeling, I went to the garage to interview the husband. He remained completely cooperative and provided a detailed account. The evidence at the scene confirmed his version his wife had slipped while stepping out of the shower, hitting her head. She refused to go to the hospital and preferred to rest, and he, respecting her wishes, let her sleep. When he realized she wouldn't wake up, he felt responsible and called 911. The man appeared to be between 75 and 80 years old, but he was lucid and articulate. We talked about his military experience and other aspects of his life while I built a connection with him. At the end of the interview, I mentioned that there was one last thing I needed to clarify. During your 911 call, you mentioned that you weren't alone in the house. What did you mean by that? He gave a slight smile and said, "You're going to think I'm crazy." I replied that after spending over an hour talking to him, I was sure he wasn't. He then began to explain that there were little people living in his house. My expression probably showed skepticism, so he clarified. "I've never seen them, but I know they're here. They're mischievous. Sometimes they flush the toilet, move objects, open cabinets and doors." At that moment, my mind immediately went back to the front door incident. He then asked me, "That happened while you were inside, didn't it?" I heard the door open. I nodded, still processing the situation. The man smiled and thanked me. "I'm glad you saw it. Now I know I'm not going crazy." Shortly after, the case was officially classified as an accidental death. But from what I could gather that night, The little people had opened the door so his wife's spirit could leave. I walked out of that house with the feeling that, regardless of personal beliefs, some mysteries will never have a definitive explanation.